December 17, 1944. The frozen earth of the Ardennes forest crunched beneath Wehrmacht boots as German officers surveyed their latest prize. Dozens of captured American soldiers, their breath visible in the bitter Belgian morning air. Among the scattered equipment lay something that would make the German officers pause, then smirk with contempt. Small rectangular boxes stamped with unfamiliar letters. K-Rations, field rations from an army they believed to be soft, pampered by the comforts of a nation that had never known true hunger on its own soil. Oberfuhrer Klaus Dietrich picked up one of the abandoned boxes, its contents rattling softly inside. At 42, Dietrich had commanded men through 3 years of increasingly desperate warfare. His gaunt frame, like those of his subordinates, bore witness to months of dwindling supplies and shrinking rations. The German Eiserne Ration, their iron ration, had been reduced to a meager 300 grams of canned meat and 125 grams of hard bread per day. Yet here, scattered across the forest floor like discarded toys, were enemy rations that seemed almost wastefully abundant. "Look at this," Dietrich muttered to his aide, Hauptmann Werner Kruger, holding up the American K-Ration box. The Americans even packaged their food like gifts. "Pretty boxes for pretty soldiers." The officers around him chuckled, a bitter sound that echoed through the pine trees. They had been told since childhood that Americans were weak, their military nothing more than a collection of factory workers and farmers playing at war. These rations seemed to confirm their prejudices. Overly elaborate packaging for an overly pampered army. What Dietrich and his men could not have imagined was that they were holding in their hands the physical manifestation of an industrial revolution in warfare, a symbol of a nation that had fundamentally reimagined how armies could be fed. The K-Ration was not merely food, it was a declaration of American industrial supremacy, designed by physiologist Ansel Keys to deliver precisely 3,000 calories per day to any soldier, anywhere in the world. Each box contained not just sustenance, but the concentrated essence of American abundance. Canned meat, processed cheese, chocolate bars, cigarettes, instant coffee, and even chewing gum. In that moment, as German officers examined these alien provisions, they unknowingly confronted the vast chasm between their own supply system and that of their enemy. The Wehrmacht's logistics had been designed for swift campaigns, lightning wars that would secure resources from conquered territories. American logistics had been designed for a different kind of conflict entirely, one that could sustain millions of men across multiple continents for years, fed from the inexhaustible production lines of Detroit, Chicago, and countless other industrial centers 6,000 miles from any battlefield. The German military had always prided itself on efficiency, on doing more with less. Their soldiers were taught to scavenge, to adapt, to make do with whatever the land could provide. The Halbizern ration system was built on the assumption that armies would supplement their meager official provisions with local resources: bread from French bakeries, meat from captured Soviet livestock, vegetables from Polish farms. It was a system that worked brilliantly during the swift victories of 1939 and 1940, but had begun to buckle under the strain of global warfare and lengthening supply lines. By December 1944, the contrast between German and American provisioning had become stark beyond imagination. German soldiers were receiving roughly 2,570 calories per day when supplies were good, often far less when they were not. American soldiers in combat zones were consuming between 3,600 and 4,500 calories daily through a combination of K-rations, C-rations, and supplementary field kitchens that served hot meals whenever tactically feasible. The German army was slowly starving. The American army was, by any historical standard, luxuriously fed. Dietrich tore open the K-Ration box with fingers stiff from cold and months of inadequate nutrition. Inside, he found items that seemed to mock everything he thought he knew about warfare. A small can of processed meat, not the gristly, fatty Schmaltzfleisch that German soldiers had learned to tolerate, but actual, recognizable beef. Compressed biscuits that were not the rock-hard Dauerbrot that could break teeth, but crackers that dissolved pleasantly in the mouth. Most incomprehensibly of all, luxuries that no rational military planner would waste precious shipping space on. Chocolate bars, instant coffee crystals, and small packs of cigarettes. They ship candy to the front lines, Kruger observed, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and growing unease. While our men make coffee from acorns, the Americans drink real coffee in foxholes. The joke that had begun in mockery was transforming into something else entirely. These were not the provisions of a weak army. They were the supplies of a military force so confident in its logistical capabilities that it could afford to pamper its soldiers with comforts that German civilians had not seen in years. The psychology of warfare shifted in that frozen forest clearing. German officers had been conditioned to believe that hardship bred superior soldiers, that American softness would collapse under the pressure of real combat. Yet here was evidence of an entirely different philosophy, that well-fed, well-supplied soldiers would fight better, longer, and with greater morale than those who were slowly wasting away from malnutrition. The K-Rations represented not weakness, but a kind of strength that Germany had never possessed, the strength of a nation that could feed its armies as abundantly in the field as at home. When Dietrich first tasted the processed American cheese, his worldview began to crumble along with the cracker in his mouth. The flavor was rich, salty, satisfying in a way that German rations had not been for months. His aide, Kruger, bit into an American chocolate bar and closed his eyes, savoring sweetness that had become a distant memory. Around them, other German soldiers were conducting their own reluctant tastings, their expressions shifting from mockery to confusion, to a dawning, terrible realization. This was not the food of a weak army. This was sustenance that could maintain fighting strength indefinitely, that could fuel advances across continents, that could support the kind of prolonged, global warfare that Germany's increasingly desperate logistics could no longer sustain. Every K-Ration box represented something that the Wehrmacht leadership had fundamentally miscalculated. America's industrial capacity was not just large, it was effectively unlimited by the standards of 1940s warfare. The numbers, had they known them, would have been even more devastating to German morale. By 1944, American factories were producing enough K-Rations to feed not just their own armed forces, but significant portions of Allied armies worldwide. The Quartermaster Corps had overseen the production of over 105 million K-Rations since 1941, each one representing a small miracle of food preservation, packaging technology, and industrial coordination. Meanwhile, German food production was declining steadily, with agricultural output falling by nearly 30% since the beginning of the war. Dietrich found himself eating slowly, methodically, trying to extract every calorie from the alien food. His body, accustomed to the gnawing hunger that had become constant among German forces, responded to the rich American provisions with an almost shameful gratitude. The processed meat provided proteins that had been increasingly rare in German rations. The chocolate delivered sugars and fats that his malnourished system craved desperately. Even the instant coffee, which dissolved completely in hot water instead of leaving the bitter dregs of ersatz substitutes, seemed like a small miracle. "How many of these do you think they produce?" Kruger asked quietly, turning the empty K-Ration box over in his hands, studying the printing, the careful design, the obvious industrial sophistication of something meant to be thrown away after a single use. The question hung in the frigid air like their visible breath. How many indeed? The answer, millions upon millions, rolling off production lines in quantities that dwarfed Germany's entire food distribution system, was beyond their imagination. The implications were staggering. If Americans could afford to package individual meals with this level of care and abundance, what did that suggest about their overall production capacity? If they were shipping chocolate and coffee to frontline troops, what luxuries were available to workers in their factories? If their soldiers were this well fed, how were they equipping their tanks, aircraft, and artillery? The K-Rations were not just food. They were intelligence about an economy so vast and productive that it could treat as routine what Germany could achieve only through extraordinary effort. Word of the American rations spread through German units with remarkable speed. Soldiers who had been surviving on increasingly meager portions of bread, ersatz coffee, and whatever supplementary food they could scavenge, found themselves confronting evidence of an enemy force that was not just better equipped, but better fed than many German civilians. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Armies, throughout history, had marched on their stomachs. What did it mean to face an army that marched on stomachs filled with chocolate and real coffee? The contrast became more pronounced as winter deepened. German supply lines, stretched across a continent and constantly harassed by partisan attacks, delivered increasingly irregular and inadequate provisions. Soldiers grew accustomed to the hollow ache of hunger, to the weakness that came from bodies consuming their own muscle mass to maintain basic functions. They learned to make thin soups from potato peels, to stretch small portions of meat across entire squads, to find sustenance in foods that would have been rejected as animal feed in peacetime. American forces, meanwhile, continued to receive not just adequate rations, but a variety of them. K-rations for combat situations, C-rations for longer-term field use, and, whenever possible, hot meals prepared by field kitchens that could produce fresh bread, hot soup, and even occasionally fresh meat. The American military had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued armies since ancient times: how to maintain fighting strength over extended campaigns without depleting local resources or establishing vulnerable supply lines. The solution lay in American industrial capacity, but also in American agricultural abundance. The United States in 1944 was producing not just enough food to feed its own population and military, but enough to send significant portions overseas through the Lend-Lease program. American farmers, using mechanized equipment and modern agricultural techniques, were achieving yields per acre that European farmers could barely imagine. The same industrial revolution that was producing tanks and aircraft was also revolutionizing food production and preservation. German intelligence officers, when they finally began to analyze captured American provisions systematically, discovered details that should have terrified their leadership. The dates stamped on K-rations revealed production schedules that suggested truly massive manufacturing capacity. The ingredients lists showed access to resources: real coffee, genuine chocolate, processed meats, that German forces could not obtain even for special occasions. Most significantly, the casual wastefulness with which American soldiers sometimes discarded partially consumed rations suggested a level of abundance that was almost incomprehensible to men who had learned to save bread. Crusts, by January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge ground to its inevitable conclusion, German officers like Dietrich were making increasingly desperate calculations. Their own men were weakening from malnutrition, just as American forces appeared to be maintaining full fighting strength, despite months of intensive combat. The K-rations had become more than food. They had become symbols of an industrial and agricultural capacity that Germany simply could not match, no matter how efficiently they organized their remaining resources. The moment of final realization came not in any single dramatic event, but in the accumulation of small observations that collectively painted an undeniable picture. American wounded who were captured appeared healthier than many German soldiers who had never been injured. Discarded American equipment showed signs of casual abundance: tools thrown away rather than repaired, equipment abandoned rather than salvaged, supplies destroyed rather than left for enemy use. Everything suggested a military force backed by production capacity so vast that individual items had no meaningful value. In his final report to higher command, dated February 3, 1945, Dietrich wrote words that would prove prophetic. The enemy's strength lies not merely in superior numbers or equipment, but in a complete system of abundance that we cannot hope to match. Their soldiers eat better in foxholes than our officers eat in garrison. This is not the decadent weakness we were told to expect, but a form of strength against which our traditional efficiencies are inadequate. The K-Ration had become, in the end, a revelation, not of American weakness, but of American power expressed in its most fundamental form, the ability to feed an army so well that chocolate and coffee became routine rather than luxuries. German officers who had begun by mocking these provisions ended by understanding that they represented something unprecedented in military history. An army that truly never starved, supported by a homeland that could produce abundance as easily as scarcity. The war would continue for 3 more months after Dietrich wrote his report, but the psychological victory had already been won in that frozen forest clearing where German officers first tasted American rations. They had confronted not just better food, but a better understanding of how wars were actually won, not through superior discipline or tactical brilliance alone, but through the unglamorous but decisive advantage of superior logistics sustained by superior production capacity. In the quiet moments before surrender, as German forces retreated across a landscape they could no longer defend, many officers found themselves remembering not the great battles or stirring speeches, but the simple taste of American chocolate dissolving on their tongues. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it had revealed a truth too large to ignore. They had been fighting not just an army, but an entire civilization organized around principles of abundance rather than scarcity, efficiency rather than desperation, industrial confidence rather than military tradition. The K-Ration boxes, scattered and empty now across a dozen European battlefields, had delivered their final message. America had not won through superior courage or tactical innovation, though both had played their part. America had won because it had solved the fundamental equation of modern warfare: how to project not just military force, but industrial abundance across global distances for sustained periods. The army that never starved had proven that in industrial warfare, logistics were not merely support for combat operations. They were combat operations, waged in factories and farms as decisively as on battlefields. And in the end, German officers who had learned to smirk at American rations discovered that they had been mocking their own defeat, packaged in small rectangular boxes and delivered with the casual abundance of a nation that had reimagined war itself.